Today, we are going to be doing a deep dive into the comic versus the show for Amazon's adaptation of... And I get to do something I don't often get to here on the channel, which is quite strongly recommend an adaptation over the original source material. Now, of course, this is my subjective opinion, and in the comments down below, you're going to see people disagreeing with me quite vehemently. But I have now watched season 1 of twice, as well as read the first complete compendium, which goes well beyond season 1. And I have a lot to say, mainly focusing on the fact that I actually believe the adaptation, yes, is an improvement, at least for that section of the story, over the comic, and that's for many, many reasons that we're going to start getting into now as we kind of review, in a sense, the comic with a tinge towards comparison. Now, for the overall structure of the adaptation itself, what they seem to have done towards the comics is a rather Master and Commander approach. For those of you who have not read those books or watched that movie, there's a lot of condensing of future material back into the earlier story to help pay things off faster, restructure quite a bit, and a lot of the best adaptations you will see have this approach. It takes a lot more effort on the writing front and inevitably means you're going to be changing quite a bit from the source material. But if you do that in a masterful hand who has the changing mediums in mind, it usually just ends up working in favor for the story itself. And that is absolutely the case for because the biggest complaint I have for the comic is that it does not have as good of hooks or characterization as the show managed to have, and its biggest narrative beats hit substantially softer than the show managed to pull off. Now, I actually stop on this specific panel for a key reason. Mark discovering his powers. A hugely substantial moment for the overall narrative. In the comic, it happens on page 4 or 5, and you have essentially no emotional investment in this relative blank slate at all in this moment. Whereas in the show, it happens at about the 15-minute mark for episode 1, after so much more effort has been put into fleshing out not only this character, but the dangers of the world around him. So the unveiling of superpowers feels like, dangerous. And on top of that, the art style, as you can see here, is rather not awesome. We have these like just beady eyes and consistent look to it, whereas the show made the very intelligent decision to, well, similar looking to the comic, feeling way more like the Justice League show, which I think inevitably gives all of us who grew up watching that an immediate emotional connection to not only the style and presentation, but watching that similar style and presentation grown up and made gory just hooks you in like that childhood nostalgia brain. Just so many great decisions made for the adaptation. Let's talk about characterization first, because in the show, Mark, the main character, the young man who is discovering his potential, is very well understood in terms of who he is and his personality. Granted, he's not the most personality-filled, super original, fantastically revolutionary, deep insights into what it would be like to become a superhero as a teen, but he's still far more charming than his comic book counterpart. Mark in the comic, I really tried to separate the two in my head and view them as two separate characters because I did not want that interpretation informing this new version in the comic I was reading. And from just what we get in the comic, there's not much there for a massive part of the beginning of the comic. He is a blank slate you put yourself on, borderline in like an Edward Cullen level. He has some snark, some ambition, but beyond that, I didn't get much. And then we flip on over to by far the most enticing character for his father, Omni-Man. Omni-Man in the show delivers one of the best hooks for a pilot I have ever seen at the end. Spoiler alert for episode 1 of but it is unveiled that he is going to be the grand villain, and he is voiced by J.K. Simmons. And the way it is unveiled that he is the villain, and the acting behind the character, is just sensational. There is a brutality to his massacring of this world's equivalent for the Justice League that hits like almost no other animated show has hit for me in terms of just showing some character's power and ability to just almost in an alien sense dwarf all of those around him, which is quite fitting for what Omni-Man is. But when the comic has the same approach for this, one, the characterization of Omni-Man just on the dialogue level isn't as interesting for me for what we got in the show, and of course J.K. Simmons' added performance overlaying what I consider better writing benefits the character greatly, but the actual scenes where he does a similar thing are just less tense, less emotionally resonant, and instead of making me go like, for the show, where I deeply understood what they were going for just because of the quality of writing around it, if I hadn't have watched season 1 of I more from the comic just would have been going like, all right, I guess he's the bad guy now, moving on. And then they try and re-deliver that scene, actually in a way that is done in the show as well, but because the show showed all of brutality up front and had Omni-Man's just weight as a villain there throughout all of season 1, there's this presence that's far more effective than what we get in the comic. And the show is so much more quality written, even though Omni-Man is hurt in his encounter with the Justice League in the show, which he isn't in the comics. He still feels more dangerous despite the presentation of him being weaker because of just everything around him. And yeah, pretty much echoing throughout that, every major just, oh shit moment from the show that I felt, which the show had plenty of, I basically got a diet version of in the comic, which in the history of adaptation is kind of the reverse. And it's really impressive to be able to say that. And some people may be commenting like it's unfair to value in something that one medium has that the other doesn't, which is the interpretation of an actor, but I call bull. I'm talking about raw entertainment value, and there are books that write villains so well that they don't need that benefit. But if we look over to this adaptation, there was a area lacking for the character that J.K. Simmons and a rewrite of him adding in made him so much more potent. And potent is the key word here, because I can talk about nitpick comparisons from comic to book again and again, but at the end of the day, what really made the show more effective is it felt like a redrafting, a draft 2 of a first draft that was initially published in the comic, because a lot of what happens in the same ground that season 1 of Invincible is covering feels either more sloppy or less needed for the overall story. But it absolutely feels like a second draft compared to a first. I think this season 1 of, if it was just turned into a comic and put out alongside the original, would absolutely be the definitive version I recommend for people. It is better structured by a gargantuan amount. The art style for the show I find much better than the comic. The characters feel more verbose in their presentation. While I think season 1 of is great, I would say the comic itself is just fine. I'm going to give it a pretty substantially light 5.5 out of 10 because it just didn't invest me. And maybe I'm partially biased because I've already seen this story presented so well that it ended up draining more gas from the tank over here. Fully willing to admit that, but I just wouldn't recommend the comic to people very much. I think it's interesting, but there are better versions of similar stories, and now I get to look at the comic and go, and a better version of that story is its adaptation. Adaptation in itself is an art form, and here is a great example of that art form being executed magnificently. I have had people tell me that the comics actually find their stride later on and get substantially better. It's just a rough start, which, you know, that's completely fair. But getting through the entire first compendium and not really feeling that improvement isn't a great sign. And if I have to wait that long to see something find its stride, is it really worth the investment, especially when the story's being retold in a more enticing way. And I don't think I'll be reading on for Invincible in the comics because I would like to wait to see the show catch up to where I've gotten and continue to put out what I see a better version of the story and just not have the major plot beats spoiled by going into the comic and seeing what is to come. Gosh, that's a whole even another angle now where I wouldn't recommend the comic because it's basically spoiling what's to come for the show, and the show's going to be more enjoyable if you don't spoil it for yourself. Wow, I feel like I'm being way harsher than is called for. It's like, I think the comic's fine, but the situation around the comic is making me feel like it's just not a necessary recommendation for almost anybody out there. But that has just been my opinion. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and hit the Patreon if you'd like to support what I do here. I got books, I got merch, and have a good one, y'all.